You poured 2 cups again, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara looked down before she looked at the woman who had said it. 1 cup sat beside her plate, black coffee cooling in the morning air. The other sat across the kitchen table, untouched, with a clean spoon laid beside it. She had not meant to set it there. Her hand had done it while her mind was still with the stove, the bread, the small blue pot that had whistled before sunrise the same way it had whistled every morning for 5 years. Clara picked up the 2nd cup without answering and carried it to the wash basin. The widow Whitmore had become a quiet fact along the creek road, same as the split-rail fence, the cottonwoods, and the narrow footbridge that crossed the water below her garden. Folks in town brought her mending when they needed it, eggs when they had too many, and news when they thought she ought to know something. She thanked them, paid what she owed, and kept her door closed after dusk. Nobody called it grief anymore. After 5 years, people stopped naming a thing and simply walked around it. Her house stood on the west bank, small and square, with smoke rising straight from the chimney on cold mornings. Across the creek, half a mile by the road, unless if a man crossed by the footbridge, Ethan Hayes kept a modest place with 8 milk cows, 2 saddle horses, and a barn roof he had patched so often it looked like a quilt made of tin. Clara had seen him for months before she heard his voice. He rose early. So did she. Some mornings, while she carried ashes out back or shook flour from her apron at the porch rail, she would see a lantern moving on the other side of the creek, steady and low, then the shape of a man crossing from barn to woodpile without hurry. He never waved first. He never stared. Once, when her gate sagged after a hard rain, she came outside with a hammer and found a new hinge left on the porch step, wrapped in brown paper with no note. She knew it came from him because the track in the mud led down toward the creek and back again. She used the hinge. She said nothing. He said nothing. That was easier. The 2nd cup stayed in the cupboard after that morning, turned backward behind the saucers where she would not reach for it by habit. Clara worked through the day with her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned tight, mending a torn coat for Mr. Pruitt, turning dough for supper bread, and cutting kindling small enough to catch quickly. Near evening, wind came down the water and rattled the east window. She looked up. Across the creek, Ethan stood by his fence with one hand resting on the top rail, his hat pulled low against the cold. He was not watching her house exactly. He was looking at the footbridge. One plank had lifted at the center, warped loose by weather. Clara noticed it because he did. The next morning, before her coffee had finished boiling, she heard the first clean sound of a hammer coming from the creek. Clara stood in the kitchen with her hand on the coffee pot and listened. The hammer struck once, then twice, with a pause between each blow, not hurried, not showy, just the sound of a man setting wood back where weather had taken it loose. She went to the east window and moved the curtain no more than an inch. Ethan Hayes was kneeling on the footbridge with his coat folded on the bank and his sleeves buttoned at the wrist. Beside him lay 3 new planks, a coffee-colored toolbox, and a small pile of nails kept in an old tobacco tin. He had brought what was needed. He had not knocked. Clara watched him pull the warped board free, test the joist beneath it with his thumb, then replace more than the broken piece because the weakness had traveled farther than a glance could see. That mattered. Men passing through often fixed what could be seen from the road. Ethan fixed what would hold under a woman carrying kindling in the rain. When the coffee boiled over, she stepped back too quickly and caught the pot with a towel before it spilled across the stove. Her hand shook once. She set the pot down and frowned at it, as if it had been the foolish thing. By the time she carried a cup outside, the sun had cleared the cottonwoods. Frost still silvered the grass. Ethan looked up when her boots reached the bank. He stood, wiped one hand on his trousers, and took his hat off because that was how men had been raised in that country when a woman came near. She held out the cup. He looked at it, then at the bridge, then back at her. He accepted it with both hands around the warmth and gave a small nod. No speech. No claim made on the kindness. Clara stepped onto the first plank and pressed her weight down. Solid. She crossed halfway, stopped, and looked at the new boards fitted between the old ones. They were plain pine, cut straight, no better and no worse than needed. Ethan stood aside on the grass and drank his coffee while she tested the bridge end to end. The creek ran narrow beneath them, brown and cold, carrying leaves toward the bend. For 5 years it had been a line between her house and the rest of the valley. That morning, with new planks under her boots, it became something smaller. She did not say that. She only looked at the tobacco tin and the careful row of nails still inside it. "I can pay you for the lumber," she said. Ethan put the empty cup on the bridge rail, where it would not fall. "Had extra." He lifted his toolbox, gathered the old warped plank under one arm, and walked back toward his side of the creek. Clara stood there until he reached his fence. Then she picked up the cup he had left behind, still warm at the rim, and carried it inside to wash beside her own. For 3 mornings after that, Clara found herself listening for the bridge before she listened for the stove. Nothing came but the usual sounds: hens worrying at the dirt, wind scraping dry leaves along the porch, the creek moving under its new boards. Ethan did not cross. He did not make the repair into a reason to appear at her door. That, more than the repair itself, made it difficult to dismiss him. On the 4th morning, she carried a basket of mended shirts in a town and came back with a sack of flour tied across one arm. The sky had turned the hard pewter color that meant rain before supper. Halfway down the creek road, the sack shifted, and the seam gave way just enough for white flour to dust her sleeve and the front of her dress. Clara stopped, set the basket down, and pinched the tier closed with 2 fingers. The road was empty behind her. Then a horse stepped out from the stand of cottonwoods ahead. Ethan was leading it, not riding, a feed sack over one shoulder and a coil of rope in his hand. He saw the flour, saw the torn seam, and stopped where the road left proper room between them. He did not reach for the sack. He took the feed sack from his own shoulder, shook it clean, and held it open. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she lowered her torn sack into it, slow and careful, and he tied the outside closed with a square knot that would not slip. Practical. Neat. Done before the rain found them. He picked up her basket only after she picked up the flour, and they walked the last quarter mile without making company of it. At her gate, he set the basket on the porch rail and stepped back. Rain began in small dark spots on the wood between them. Clara went inside, set the flour by the larder, and stood with her hand still on the sack. Then she turned, took the second cup from behind the saucers, and filled it before she could decide not to. Ethan was already halfway to the bridge when she came to the porch. She did not call loudly. She only said his name. He stopped at once. Clara held the cup where he could see it. The rain thickened over the creek, soft and steady, and for the first time, Ethan Hayes crossed the bridge without a tool in his hand. The cup had cooled some by the time Ethan reached the porch, but he took it as if it had been handed across a much greater distance than the 12 feet between them. Clara stepped aside. Not far. Just enough to make room under the roof while the rain came down in earnest and turned the yard dark. Ethan removed his hat, shook water from the brim, and stood near the outer post instead of moving closer to the door. He drank his coffee slowly. Clara noticed that he held the cup in both hands, not because he needed the warmth, but because a man with both hands occupied could not be mistaken for asking anything more. The rain filled the space where talk might have gone. It ran from the eaves, ticked against the porch steps, and gathered in the ruts of the road. Across the creek, his horse stood under the cottonwoods with patient misery, tail twitching once in a while. Clara went inside without speaking and came back with a piece of oilcloth. She handed it to him. He looked at it, then looked toward the horse and nodded once. He crossed the yard, covered the saddle, checked the cinch, and came back with mud dark on his boots. He did not track it across her porch. He scraped each sole against the step until most of the wet dirt fell away. Small things. They were the kind of things a woman who had lived alone learned to see. After a while, Clara opened the door behind her and reached in for the coffee pot. She filled his cup again without asking. Ethan watched the creek. The new planks held steady under the rain. Water rushed below them, brown and quick, but the bridge stayed sure. Clara held her own cup near her chest. In the kitchen behind her, the chair by the window sat empty, angled toward the stove the way it had been since Thomas Whitmore had last used it. No visitor sat there. No neighbor leaned a coat over its back. Clara dusted it every Saturday and moved it only when sweeping required it. Ethan's eyes went to it once through the open door, not long enough to pry, only long enough to understand there was a boundary inside the house that did not need a rope around it. He looked away first. When the rain eased to a thin silver fall, he set the empty cup on the porch rail, the same careful way he had left it on the bridge. "Much obliged," he said. Then he put on his hat and went down the steps. Clara watched him cross the footbridge, oilcloth tucked under one arm to return another day. Before he reached the far bank, she picked up the cup, carried it inside, washed it, dried it, and set it on the shelf beside her own instead of behind the saucers. The oilcloth came back folded square on the porch rail the next morning, weighed down with a smooth creek stone so the wind would not take it. Beside it sat a small paper twist of coffee beans from the mercantile, tied with plain string. Clara stood in the doorway with her apron still dusted in flour and looked across the water. Ethan was already in his barn, the door open, his shoulder moving with the steady rhythm of a man forking hay before the day warmed. He had returned what was borrowed. He had replaced what was used. He had added nothing that required thanks beyond what was proper. Clara took the beans inside and put them in the blue pot before she could think too long on it. The smell filled the kitchen stronger than her usual coffee, dark and clean, and for a moment the house seemed less hollow than it had when she woke. She drank 1 cup standing at the stove, then wrapped 2 biscuits in a cloth and carried them to the bridge. She left them on the rail where he would see them when he crossed to check the lower fence line. That was how the days began to change. Not quickly, not in a way town women could point at and name. A hinge became Biscuits. Biscuits became a jar of apple butter from Clara's pantry, set beside his empty tobacco tin after he mended the latch on her chicken coop. The jar came back washed, with 6 brown eggs tucked inside because one of his hens had started laying more than he needed. Clara used the eggs for cornbread and sent half the pan across with Mrs. Pruitt's boy when he passed on horseback. The boy came back with her dish before supper, clean enough to tell her Ethan had washed it himself. No note. No foolishness. Just work answered by work, kindness answered by kindness, until the creek began carrying more than water between the 2 places. One Thursday, Clara heard a calf bawling from Ethan's side before sunup. She knew that sound. Not danger, not yet, but distress enough to pull a body from the stove. She crossed the bridge with her shawl over her shoulders and found Ethan in the yard with a small red calf shivering near the fence, its back legs unsteady from cold mud. Ethan had already rubbed it down with feed sacks and laid straw near the barn door. Clara said nothing. She went straight to the calf, set her hand behind its ear, and looked toward the house. Warm molasses water, she said. Ethan was moving before the words had settled. He brought the pail. She mixed it, tested it with her finger, and helped steady the calf while it drank. Her sleeves were wet to the elbow. Mud marked the hem of her dress. Ethan noticed both and said nothing about either. When the calf finally stood, narrow-legged but willing, Clara stepped back and wiped her hands on the sack he offered. He poured coffee from a blackened pot by the barn stove into 2 tin cups. They drank standing in the doorway while the calf pressed close to its mother. Across the creek, Clara's chimney smoked unattended for the first time in years. She looked back at it. Ethan followed her gaze, then went to a peg by the wall and took down a clean wool blanket. He handed it over without ceremony, not for her shoulders, not in a way that made a moment of it, but because her sleeves were damp and the morning was cold. Clara took it. She did not need to. That was the difference. At home later, she hung the blanket near the stove to dry before returning it. The chair by the window stood in its usual place, empty and exact. Clara looked at it while the blue coffee pot began to whisper on the stove. Then she took the second cup from the shelf and set it on the table, not across from her this time, but beside the chair where a guest might reach it if he were ever asked to sit. By Saturday, the calf had found its legs, and the valley had found the story. Mrs. Pruitt mentioned it while handing Clara a torn sleeve at the mercantile, careful with her smile, as if a calf drinking molasses water could explain why the widow Whitmore had been seen coming home with a man's blanket over her arm. Clara paid for thread, folded the sleeve into her basket, and gave no answer. Some things grew weaker when spoken over too much. Others needed silence around them, the way dough needed a cloth and a warm corner. That afternoon, Mrs. Pruitt's youngest boy, Samuel, came running down the creek road with one suspender loose and a tin pail banging against his knee. His mother had sent him for eggs, but the boy stopped at Clara's gate when he saw Ethan repairing the lower fence on his side of the water. Samuel had never met a fence he did not want to climb or a question he could leave inside his head. He crossed the bridge without asking, crouched near Ethan's toolbox, and began sorting nails by size with the grave importance of a child doing man's work. Clara watched from her porch, ready to call him back if he became trouble. Ethan only shifted the open tin closer to the boy's reach. He did not make a fuss. He showed Samuel how to hold a bent nail against the flat stone and tap it straight instead of throwing it away. The boy missed twice, got it right once, and looked up as if the whole county ought to know. Ethan nodded. That was enough. Clara went inside and cut 3 slices of cornbread instead of 2. When she crossed with the plate and the blue coffee pot wrapped in a towel, Samuel was holding a fence staple between 2 fingers, listening hard while Ethan pointed to the split rail and explained where strains settled after a wet season. Not many men explained work to children as if the understanding mattered. Clara set the plate on a stump. Ethan took 1 piece only after Samuel took his, and Samuel, with crumbs already on his shirt front, announced that Mrs. Whitmore made better cornbread than the hotel. Clara looked at the creek until the corner of her mouth behaved itself. The next week settled into small crossings. Samuel brought his mother's mending and stayed to carry kindling. Mrs. Pruitt sent over a crock of beans after church because she had made too much, though everyone knew she rarely made too much of anything. Ethan returned the crock with a repaired handle, a neat strip of wire tightened around the crack. Clara began keeping coffee warm past noon on days when fence work or weather might bring a man within reach of the porch. She did not call it waiting. She called it not wasting a fire. On Thursday, the wind turned sharp and brought a hard gray rain before evening. Samuel was caught in it on his way back from delivering shirts. Clara pulled him inside, set him near the stove, and gave him a towel for his hair. Ethan arrived 10 minutes later with the boy's forgotten pail in one hand and his own coat buttoned wrong from hurry. He stopped at the threshold when he saw Samuel's safe, then removed his hat and stood there dripping on the step. Clara looked at the chair by the window, the one no one used. She moved the second cup beside it, then pulled the chair out with both hands and turned it toward the stove. Ethan saw the movement. So did Samuel. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Ethan stepped inside, scraped his boots carefully, and sat where grief had kept a place for 5 years. The chair did not change the house all at once. Nothing true ever did. Ethan sat near the stove while Samuel warmed his hands around a cup of watered coffee, and Clara moved through the kitchen with the practiced care of a woman learning where not to look. The chair held. The room held. When Ethan left, he set the cup in the wash basin instead of leaving it for her, then carried in enough wood from the porch pile to make up for what the rain had cost. After that evening, he did not assume the chair was his. He waited at the threshold the next time weather brought him over, hat in hand, until Clara moved the cup beside the window. Only then did he sit. Trust came that way. Not taken. Not declared. Set down carefully, like hot coffee on a table scarred by years of use. Then the week without him began. On Monday morning, there was no lantern moving by the barn across the creek. Clara noticed while cutting biscuit dough and pressed the cutter too hard through the flour. On Tuesday, his milk cows bawled past their usual hour, and Mrs. Pruitt's oldest boy came riding from town to tend them, saying Mr. Hayes had been called 12 miles north to help move cattle before the creek roads turned poor. Clara nodded, handed the boy a paper twist of salt pork for his trouble, and sent him back across with a covered pan of cornbread for the bunkhouse men. By Thursday, the blue coffee pot stayed full too long. By Friday, Samuel came to return a mended shirt and found Clara repairing one of Ethan's torn work gloves by the window. She had found it behind the chair after the rain. She had meant to send it back untouched. Instead, she turned the leather in her hand, saw the seam split across the palm, and threaded a needle strong enough to hold. Samuel watched her knot the thread. Mr. Hayes will need that, he said. Clara made one more careful stitch. Then it ought to be ready. Saturday brought frost. The footbridge shone pale in the early light, and Ethan's place looked too still. Clara stood at her stove until the coffee began to bitter. Then she poured it out, washed the pot, filled it fresh, and packed it in a towel with biscuits, the repaired glove, and a small jar of apple butter. She crossed the bridge before the town had reason to notice. On Ethan's porch, she swept wind-blown leaves from the step, set the food inside his cool kitchen, and stirred the banked coals until the stove took flame. She did not search his things. She did not make herself at home by presuming. She made the place ready for a tired man to return to, because that was what had been done for her in smaller ways again and again. Before she left, she placed the mended glove beside his coffee cup. Then she saw the folded paper tucked under the sugar tin with her name written on it in Ethan's plain hand. And for the first time since Thomas died, Clara Whitmore sat down in another man's kitchen and opened what had been left for her. The paper held only 3 lines, but Clara read them twice before the stove had fully caught. North Herd ran farther than expected. Roads may close before Sunday. If I am late, do not cross after dark. Beneath that, almost as an afterthought, he had written, there is coffee in the blue tin if yours runs low. Clara folded the note along the old crease and set it beside the mended glove. It was not a promise. It was not a claim. It was a man thinking of her kitchen from 12 miles away while the weather turned and work pulled at him. She washed his cup, banked his fire safe, and went home before the frost left the grass. By afternoon, town had started talking. Mrs. Pruitt came for the mended shirts and found Clara hanging Ethan's clean blanket on the line. She looked at the blanket, then at the second cup drying beside Clara's. On the shelf. Clara waited for the question. Mrs. Pruitt only set 2 jars of peaches on the table and said Samuel had taken a liking to straighten nails. Clara put 1 jar in the pantry and left the other out. That evening, a wagon came slow along the north road, mud to the hubs, 1 wheel wrapped with chain. Ethan walked beside the team, coat dark with rain, leading the near horse by the bridle. 2 ranch hands rode behind him, cold and worn, and Samuel came running from the Pruitt place before anyone could stop him. Clara did not think. She put the coffee pot on, took down every cup she owned, and opened her door before the wagon reached the creek. Ethan stopped at the far end of the bridge when he saw smoke from her chimney and light in her window. The men behind him looked toward town, then toward Clara's house, measuring what folks might say. Ethan crossed first. He carried a sack of flour on one shoulder, her flour, bought to replace what had spilled days before, and set it just inside her doorway where anyone could see whose side of the creek he had chosen. Then he took the repaired glove from the table, pulled it on, and stood by her woodbox as if he had belonged to that work all along. By the time the last ranch hand had eaten, Clara's kitchen looked more lived in than it had in years. Cups stood in a crooked row by the basin. Mud dried near the threshold where Samuel had forgotten to scrape his boots. The chair by the window had been pulled closer to the stove, and Ethan sat there with his repaired glove resting across one knee, quiet in the warmth she had made. Clara moved between table and stove without hurrying. She cut the last of the cornbread, poured coffee from the blue pot, and set 1 cup beside Ethan before filling her own. He looked at the flour sack near the door, then at the wood stacked full beside the hearth, then at her. No man needed to say much when his hands had already spoken. Outside, the creek ran dark under the bridge, no longer wide enough to keep 2 lives apart. Mrs. Pruitt came in for Samuel and found him asleep with his head on folded arms. At the table, crumbs on his sleeve and 1 straightened nail still held in his palm. She looked around the room, at the cups, the blanket, the men finishing their meal, and Clara standing easy in her own kitchen. For once, she said nothing at all. When the house emptied, Ethan carried the last basin of water out and came back to find Clara at the shelf. She took down the old photograph of Thomas, wiped the frame with her apron, and set it back where the morning light could reach it. Then she placed the second coffee cup beneath it, clean and ready. Ethan watched, still by the door. Clara turned to the table, pulled the chair by the window a little closer, and set his cup there with both hands. He crossed the room slowly, sat, and warmed his palms around the coffee. Clara sat across from him, the creek murmuring beyond the glass, the stove holding steady, the house breathing around them like it had been waiting all along.